Hello and welcome. My name is Phil Cohen. I'm here today to talk to you about business immigration to Canada from the perspective of what to consider when starting or buying a business to qualify under business immigration programs. First to mention, to make the slides bigger, just double click on the slides so they can be more prominent than me. I think they're more important. Okay. So to start, there are various programs in Canada that allow for people to emigrate based on the fact that they will be starting a business or in some cases purchasing a business. Before we begin, I should make it clear to everyone watching that what we will be talking about is at a very high level only. As you might imagine, there are many people who want to emigrate to Canada, and the government has set up many hoops to jump through in order to qualify. These hoops are, in my opinion, a way to ensure that people genuinely have an intent to operate a business here if it's going to serve as a basis for a visa or for immigration. So let's get started. So I'll kick things off with a brief introduction of who I am and what my company does so you can understand the perspective I'm coming from. I am the president and founder of Strategic Element. We've been around since 2010, serving immigration lawyers and their clients on both sides of the Canada-US border. My company focuses on developing business plans, feasibility studies, and study plans for study visas. We also help prospective immigrants to find businesses to buy or to set up local operations. I'm a regular speaker at industry events in both Canada and the US, and I have a personal history of developing businesses and launching them since 1993. Our focus is on the higher end of the market and working with clients who want to reduce risk of refusal and the headaches that come with that. Okay, so first thing, what does business immigration really mean? Generally speaking, when people look to emigrate, in my experience, their intentions are often just as much about changing where they live or getting their kids into school outside of their own country as it is about wanting to start a business here. First, there are various possible programs one might look at, both at the federal and provincial level. Federal programs can be found on the Immigration Canada website. Provincial programs can usually be found on various provincial government websites. The highest immigration demand is typically for Ontario and British Columbia, so the bar for qualifying in those provinces is typically higher. Conversely, smaller population provinces tend to have easier requirements to encourage investment and job creation, although that's not always the case. It's also worth noting that every once in a while, smaller provinces make their programs very easy, sometimes for just a short time, creating a window of opportunity for those on limited budget or with more limited qualifications. Ideally, when looking to emigrate under a business immigration program, people should try to match their skills and experience to the business they want to start. In some cases, however, a shift in industry focus might work for somebody who has a history of senior management experience, although that comes with some warnings, so good legal counsel is always a good idea. Lastly, I want to point out that the process is not easy. If you operate a business elsewhere and want to open something similar here, that is usually the best bet. Others can still qualify, but good legal and business advice and good market research, among other things I will be discussing today, are important to make a viable case. So let's take a closer look first at federal programs versus provincial programs in a bit more detail. There are three main programs that we see being most commonly used at the federal level, at least as it relates to business immigration. These are intra-company transfer, owner-operator LMIA, and startup. It's worth noting that many people tend to get excited about the last program, but it's actually a difficult one to make work. The reason people get excited about it is that it involves venture capitalists and getting approval from venture capitalists, and therefore means getting money in the door. But that's a very tough hurdle to cross or to mount. The provincial picture is a bit different. Each province has the ability to create its own program, and not every province does. Provincial standards can change from time to time depending on each province's shifting needs and political views. Largely speaking, immigrants tend to be more familiar with our biggest cities, and therefore the highest demands are for programs in Ontario and BC, as I mentioned, both of which tend to have ongoing business immigration programs. Quebec is also a popular destination because they have a unique view on immigration programs. However, there is no provincial program there for business immigration per se. Other provinces like Prince Edward Island and Saskatchewan have programs that are generally easier to qualify for, in part to stimulate foreign investment and for so-called lower demand provinces. So what are the main considerations for business immigration? What do we want to know at a high level? First, one needs to develop a logical business plan with a logical flow that demonstrates how the company will make money. Behind that, we want to show how will it generate sales? How profitable will it be? What is the revenue and profit picture? Is it enough? Is it too much? And yes, by the way, there is such a thing as too much of a good thing in immigration business plans. And that's true of most business plans where you're trying to persuade somebody of your business. Are the expenses reasonable? One should ask themselves, why should the authorities believe what's being presented in the plan? In other words, what makes this plan credible? The most common mistake I see is people coming in with grandiose plans, but without the backing to make it believable. The kind of backing I'm talking about usually comes in the form of experience, market knowledge, the right team, industry contacts, and so on. So here's your first takeaway. Credibility is at the heart of most everything I will be presenting today. It should drive all the decision-making throughout the process beyond meeting the legal requirements themselves. Most programs require that the business in question be majority owned by the applicant. And the last point says, consider the minimum viable case. What this means is we encourage our clients not to overproject sales and profits unless they are abundantly confident or insistent that this is what they intend or expect to achieve. We often say show enough and hopefully a bit more than just enough than what is required to meet the guidelines, but beyond that, not to overcommit to investments, hiring, and expansion plans unless the business really needs it or is not substantial enough without it. This approach often adds credibility and at the same time gives the applicant or business owner some breathing room if things don't go necessarily according to plan. We often say you might be faulted for overpromising, but you won't be faulted for over-delivering, much like the old sales adage. Okay, another thing to bear in mind is that there are some things that permeate the whole business plans. I'm circling back again to credibility, and I'll keep doing so throughout this session. If the plan is not credible for any of a number of reasons, there is not much point in continuing. For every claim or mission-critical part of the plan, think of making a stranger believe that these things can be achieved beyond just your enthusiasm. It shows immigration officers that you can do what you say, and at the same time, it gives them less of an opportunity to poke holes in your business case. A universal truth about business immigration is that if improperly crafted, a business plan can be something of a house of cards. I've seen many cases in Canada and the US where a few fundamental pieces of a business case were unconvincing, and rather than just attack those points, immigration officers will sometimes throw the kitchen sink at the whole submission, which makes it very challenging at that point to address and fix. On the issue of supporting legal requirements, we will not get into what's appropriate for legal issues here, but most business immigration programs have three common needs. Investment. The investment level must be sufficient. There must be hands-on management by the applicant, and there must be sufficient job creation. Of course, there are many other issues that apply in each case, but these are the most common themes throughout most programs. And a note on cultural factors. This can often make for a difficult hurdle for someone who has not lived, studied, or worked in North America. For example, from a business plan perspective, it's our experience that depending on the country they come from, business immigrants who are self-made in their own country may have done so without much of a plan, backed by the kind of rigor that is more common here. I'd go further and I'd say that I'd seen that to be the case quite often, as often as not perhaps, and it really depends on the country. That's not a criticism, it's just a cultural difference. The more aware of this point prospective immigrants are, prospective immigrant is, the better off they'll ultimately be because they can get the right kind of help or learn what they need to learn to make up for those differences. So broadly speaking, there are a few key goals or points of interest to consider when considering a business case one will make. The first thing is to get a feel for whether the business presents a taking over the world kind of attitude versus making a steady growing profit. Again, it's about overenthusiasm is what I mean. A common mistake with business planning when there's an approval involved, be it a bank loan, venture financing, or business immigration, is to overstate what the business will achieve with grandiose projections in order to impress. The guiding principle, however, should be to keep it simple, but more than a little. Next, consider how you'll set up, build, and expand the business, or build the environment. This means outlining the steps that we'll be taking to getting the doors open and making sales. This projects both the knowledge of the business and how it will come together, and it projects true planning and intent. Next, consider the team. How, who, and when hiring will take place. We also want to see a team in place that is capable of delivering on the goals. The higher the goal and the more challenges a company stands to face, the more expertise and experience that should be manifest in the team or the required team, depending on how it's being presented. Next, consider what demonstrable action to make sales has been taken. In other words, make sure there is a story to tell that includes what's been done so far, what will be done moving forward, and is it convincing? For example, have contacts been made in the marketplace? Maybe there have been meetings with potential clients. Maybe experts have been consulted, and so on. The bottom line here is to present some real feet on the ground kind of action in depth or validation of the opportunity. Delivering. This is about presenting expertise, market knowledge, and ongoing operations. From an operations perspective, the plan should present an outline of key processes in the business. Next, it's important to consider and present what the financial picture looks like. We will come back to this in more detail. And again, we come back to credibility. The bottom line is to build a plan where all the pieces fit together logically. It's easy to believe why the business will succeed. And one extra consideration for credibility is an applicant's lack of experience or market knowledge. How is that going to be mitigated? So again, comes back to team and or expertise. And lastly, there should be strong fundamental assumptions that serve as the base for the business case. Initially, one should try to answer the following questions to get an idea of what kind of story the business case can present. The key things to look at are, what is it? In other words, what's the business? How does it make money? What's the model? Is it a sensible concept? Look at the executive summary. It should really encapsulate the whole story. Is it a reasonable overview of the idea and planned achievements? Is it a new product or new idea? If so, it's often harder to prove demand, so harder to believe. So make sure you work on surmounting that point. Is it an old product or an existing idea? If so, present what your differentiators are going to be. How are you going to break into the market and get market share? Look at the fragmentation of the market. Is the market spread out among many small businesses, or is there one large dominant business in the space? Each one requires a different approach to being convincing. So let's take a look now at how to consider financial projections to make a strong case. First of all, even if a program only asks for 3 years of numbers, we always suggest presenting 5 for a more thorough business case. A quick look at the annual view of the financial projections should paint a high-level picture showing things such as what does growth look like? What does profitability look like? And how are these numbers determined? When looking at revenue and profit projections, this is what to consider. Are revenues looking high? It should be reasonable to say so, but remember that high projections are likely to draw more scrutiny. So make sure it's believable. For example, maybe the product is just expensive. Maybe there's a very strong indication of demand or even pre-orders. All those things can substantiate high projections. But if you don't have that kind of substantiation, be wary of what you're saying. Consider the reasoning and assumptions stated throughout the plan. Do they make sense? Are they objective or just opinions of the applicant? Also consider the timing of the revenue. Does cash start flowing at a reasonable time? Maybe too soon. That would be okay for retail, for example, but maybe less so for wholesale businesses. So in other words, a retail store opens the door, presumably if it's in a high traffic area, it's done some marketing ahead of time. It's reasonable to assume there will be dollars flowing on day one. But a wholesale business takes a bit more work and a bit more market development and presentations, for example, usually. And therefore, and payment terms are not immediate all the time. So those things always should be considered in how things are being presented. Is there a steep growth curve? If so, some caution applies. That's essentially what I was referring to in my last point. Okay, so let's dig a bit deeper now, looking at the monthly view of the financial projections. The first thing to look at is the monthly view. The first 18 to 24 months are important because this is usually a critical ramp-up period. Breaking it down a bit further, consider first the pictures in months 1 to 3, getting started. Slow sales are usually justifiable, even expected, again, depending on the business. Next, consider the picture in months 4 to 12. How and when are sales coming in? Are we seeing declining losses or increasing profits? It varies by industry, but most should show some steady progress. Consider as an example, a business that builds houses one at a time. This might show nothing but expenses for 6 to 12 months, and then all revenue comes in soon after the house is completed and sold. One should also consider whether profits present a reasonable return on investment by year 3 or so and onward. Wherever possible, one should try to do some independent validation. For example, comparing to industry averages and standards, comparing salaries to a salaried job, plus the return of the cost and time and investment being made in the business and the risk of setting up the business, and so on. So in other words, we've seen immigration officers look at business plans and say, well, you're investing $500,000 in starting this business, and your returns by year 2, when you're showing a stabilized business plan, are just 5% of that amount. Your profit's 5%. I'm using random numbers here, but when you consider to making an investment in the market, and plus the fact that this person could be having a job, that return is actually not reasonable at all. And they might just say, well, why would you? So it's not that they make those kind of assessments all the time, but we have seen it done. Ultimately, a business's success comes down to revenues and profits, so we must closely examine how well we can prove what's being shown. Of course, there's no such thing as fully proving a financial projection, but it should be built on a foundation of strong logic. Consider, for example, a fictitious tropical island where the hot sun shines most every day, and you're starting a business that makes ice and sells icy cold drinks, and there's no other such business on the island. That is a simple but strong business case. Not likely, but simple and strong. This stage of assessment is one of the acid tests of a business plan. We want to look now and see how the story plays out. Do the numbers support the words and vice versa? We want to make sure that the timelines match each other. Remember too that money and activities sometimes move at slightly different paces. For example, the business may talk about making sales in month 3, but maybe they are taking a deposit on the sale of 50% up front within 30 days of making a sale. Maybe they're taking another 50% upon making delivery of the product, again payable in 30 days. In other words, sometimes the actual flow of money is a bit different than what the story says. We essentially want to make sure that revenues and other financial details match the story being presented. Other supporting documents, other supporting elements to this logical flow are presenting demand, ability to meet demand, ability to sell over the competition, and the ability to deliver. Next, we look to make sure that the assumptions bridge the gap between the story and the numbers. So whenever you present numbers, we always present assumptions behind the numbers. So people, if it's not written out in the business plan, sometimes little things need to be explained. It could be as simple as we're paying $150 a month for internet because we need the highest speed possible or something. But it's just an explanation of where the numbers come from. So we say avoid conclusive assumptions, focus on sales assumptions primarily, and make sure expenses are reasonable. Okay, the next thing we want to be able to present in a business case is about funding and timing. Basically, sources and uses of funds being invested in the business. Where did that money come from, and where is it going to be spent specifically? You don't need to outline every single little expense and purchase of paper clips and so on, but you do need to say office supplies and equipment, $150 a month, right down to that level. We also need to show that losses are manageable. For example, where will the money to support losses come from? So it's one thing to build a projection, but the more optimistic your projection is, the more likely it is in reality that you may not meet that projection. So you should take that into account and make sure you explain that if we don't meet these projections, or if our expenses are higher, that you'll have some contingency funds available beyond just the initial investment. Okay, let's just talk briefly about SWOT analysis. First, what is SWOT? It's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. An MBA grad will tell you that it's a must-have as a standalone, but a good business plan can address it throughout the plan. In other words, a business grad or more recent business grads tend to have a SWOT analysis page. It's fine, but we prefer to present it as part of the whole story and make sure to highlight everything. These are mostly self-explanatory, but the one thing I'd point out in particular is not to shy away from threats and weaknesses. Every business has its challenges. If you don't present them, a good official will look for them. Rather, highlight them and present the solutions and the mitigating factors. So strengths, sorry, just put up these points quickly. Whoops. And then I will move on. Okay. I spoke earlier about demonstrating market knowledge. The most important note about market research and data when it comes to business immigration is that it may often be the only independent validation in a business plan, short of team experience or actual evidence of demand or sales. As such, it must be strong, supportive, and recent. The best and easiest way to present this in an immigration business plan is to be able to show real contacts, real interest, and or direct demand for what the business will be selling. Unfortunately for most, this is not easily done, if not impossible in some cases. So what are the alternatives? A feasibility study is a customized analysis of a business. And we often suggest these studies, but many don't want to pay the price. They can cost anywhere from $5,000 to $8,000 for a small business, which is more than what a business plan costs. But they are very, very hard to contest. Generally speaking, you want to make sure you're explaining who the market is, who they are, where they are, what motivates them, what other key characteristics they may have. And the source and the date of any data being presented is really important. Otherwise, it's almost like people will assume you're making it up very often. So reasonable sources for market research, official research reports. Sorry, this is aside from feasibility studies, official research reports, feasibility studies, and lastly, in some cases, validation may need to come in the form of speaking to potential clients or getting letters of interest or letters of intent. As I said, this is a very high-level presentation. So what I'm doing is taking you through some of the key things to consider, but good advice is really important in this process, be it from your legal team, from your business team, companies such as ours, or other your business lawyer, your accountants. There are all kinds of people who should be part of your immigration process who can help you and advise you throughout the time. And everyone brings a different perspective to the table. So just a few now concluding thoughts. As I said, there are only key points being presented here. When you're presenting in your business plan, make sure your language is clear and concise. Avoid flowery language, avoid first person, and avoid grandiose claims. And make sure there's a flow to your business plan. Make sure there's a beginning, a middle, and end, a logical flow to the whole thing. Build the case from the beginning. A leads to B, B leads to C, C leads to D, and D leads to profits, and so on. Don't write a business plan in bullet form throughout. It's okay to use bullets for subtopics or to illustrate, sub-level of a list of information, but certainly not for the whole business plan. That brings us to the end of this presentation. If you have any questions in the few minutes we have left, you can put them into the chat screen.